And welcome to everyone. As Vanessa said, I've been invited to talk a little bit about this book that has been published a month ago. And instead of really going into the book chapter by chapter and telling you about the content, I just trust that if you're interested, that you will find that out by yourselves. I want to talk a little bit about the main themes that weave themselves through the entire book. But before I do that, I want to welcome everybody who has turned up here today, and also people who've turned up online. And I want to welcome the possibilities that sit with us as we meet here today. Welcome to our human beauty, to our ingenuity, and to our capacity to love. And welcome also to our vulnerability, to our fears, to our fallibility, and to our shadow sides. I also want to welcome our numbness and our capacity to dissociate when we feel overwhelmed. And that includes our capacity to forget what is important. These are adaptations to an alien culture. And I want to welcome the parts of us that are unknown, that we don't often speak about. So everything that is unnamed, that is forgotten, and that is exiled. Welcome to the parts in us and in the collective culture that have not been welcomed. So let's welcome it all, because if we don't, it doesn't mean that these parts don't exist. It just means that we're no longer in relation to them. And where have they got to go? So I want to welcome everything that we exile into the shadow fight in us and in our culture. And start to do a very small step to bring it into relation. Because if we don't, this is a loss that is so deep that we no longer can turn towards any step of healing. So what happens to the wound? And how will this wound have a chance to heal if we don't have the words and the relationship? Okay, so welcome as well to our dependence on technology and our struggles with technology. And of course, welcome to our delicate, vulnerable bodies and the scars in them. And I am not familiar to this land, but I am grateful and want to also welcome the land that I've been invited to, and the scars that have been inflicted onto this land. So let's not turn away from that. And welcome to the more than human life that surrounds us as we meet, that we depend upon, and without which us being here would not be possible. Welcome to everything that came before us and everything that awaits us in the future. So I want to welcome everything that is part of this moment. And if you're willing, then I would invite us into just a few moments of silence to acknowledge the beauty and the richness of life that is pulsing through us as we meet. And I would like to start with 2 readings and invite also the imaginal realm into our space here together.
and into the space for people at home as well. The first one is by Mary Oliver, which probably many of you will know, and it is called Lead. Here's a story to break your heart. Are you willing? This winter, the loons came to our harbor and died one by one of nothing you could see. A friend told me of one on the shore that lifted its head and opened the elegant beak and cried out in the long, sweet savoring of its life, which, if you've heard it, you know is a sacred thing, and for which, if you have not heard it, you had better hurry to where they still sing. And believe me, tell no one just where that is. The next morning, this loon, speckled and iridescent, and with a plan to fly home to some hidden lake, was dead on the shore. I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. And the next one is actually something that I wrote in 2017, at a time when I was told that I may have to have an operation that would result in me possibly losing my voice forever. And at that point, I realized that I had not even begun to use my voice. And as so often in times like these, there's also a hidden discovery and a hidden gift in that. And so that was the first time I started to write and feel like maybe I can say some things that until that point felt unsayable for me. And so I just want to read you this, not particularly to say that, I guess I want to read you this because we all have a voice. And in my work, also as a trauma therapist, I feel like this is a time when a lot of people who felt like they didn't have a voice start to step up. And in one way or another, start to find their voice. And so this was the start of me finding my voice. I'm a white European woman. I carry the horrors of Auschwitz, industrialization, and the empire in my bones. The traces of the Berlin Wall run through my body like an invisible chain. The raping of women and the raping of the earth has scarred the texture of my femininity. My voice is silenced by patriarchy. Plastic in the oceans clogs my veins. Refugees washed up on the shores of our rich countries make me blind and numb. My body contracts in a futile attempt to rid myself of my binging on accumulated privilege. In order to survive, I anesthetize my human experience. I have forgotten how to connect with the land underneath my feet. I have killed off any notion that the earth may be alive. I have banished God and the idea of the sacred. What I believe in is my individuality and the value of owning things. Matter is dead. I feel lost and empty. I live in a world and in a body that I no longer know how to inhabit. I have settled in this no man's land, but I am not alone. It is densely populated here. Sometimes, in certain precious moments, my body remembers that I am made of the earth. What I call I is made up of more microorganisms than human cells. I is not an entity, but a multiplicity, a reciprocal relationship between the human and the more than human. I am made up of stardust, oxygen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus, just like the world around me. I am not separate from it, I am made of it. And in those precious moments, I feel a sense of wonder. So, as I said to you, I am going to speak broadly about some themes that weave themselves through the book Climate Psychology and Change, that 34 amazing people, including the GTDF and Mark Skelding, who's also here, have contributed to. And that includes people from all over the world. And that seemed really important to have a kaleidoscope of voices represented. And I often get asked, even a couple of days ago, excuse me, why a psychological dimension to the meta crisis may be important, when actually, isn't that a bit luxurious? Talking about how we feel when there's so much practical stuff that we have to do. After all, we need to look after CO2 emissions and getting them down. We need to look after the economy, the technology, agriculture, maybe education. So isn't a psychological perspective really marginal, an additional bonus if you have the time to think about it? And so could you maybe show the slide? Ah, that was the book. Yeah, thank you. So sadly, the compartmentalized way in which we view the problem repeats often the very same logic that is at the heart of the problem. And so the same things that we marginalize are often also kept out of the way that we look for the solutions. Could I ask you for the next slide? Oh, okay. Well, it's got some statistics on there, which is often what I get asked for. So meanwhile, we know that 55% of the British population, this was a really large survey, feel that climate change has affected their mental health. So that's over half of the population. And I presume that there's maybe also some funny text. Great, okay, so this is interesting. You can just leave it there. No, just, yeah. So this is a really large study that says that 75%, this was 10,000 young people in 10 different countries all over the world, that 75% of young people feel that the future is frightening. And Google search data has also shown that search results in English about climate anxiety have risen 27 times since 2017. So this is usually what I get asked to talk about as a climate psychology consultant. We know that climate change impacts on our mental health. And we also know that scared people don't tend to take good decisions. But what's sad, I think statistics and numbers are really important. What is sad, however, that when we talk about the psychological impact of climate change, that often statistics and numbers are the only thing that is interesting to people. And so what this book is not about is statistics and numbers. There's a lot of brilliant research out there. And as the Google results show, there will be quite a lot of results coming up when you search for climate anxiety or climate distress. But not everything that can't be counted means that it doesn't count. And so it's the things that can't be counted that this book is about. So the public Western discourse tends to speak about humans as though we're purely logical and rational creatures that respond to rational information and rational marching orders in rational ways. So I have, in my time, read a lot of risk assessments, a lot of policies, and a lot of media communication. And this is often how the logic goes. However, we also know that this kind of approach has been applied ever since we've known about climate change. And it hasn't actually resulted in a logical and rational response to it. And so the irrational, the emotional, the unconscious, the illogical responses of our human psyche are very much left out in our policies, in our risk assessments, and in political agendas, and also the media communication. So our human capacity for denial, for deflection, for projection, for dysregulation, for reactivity, dissociation, numbing, and all sorts of psychological defenses and basic human responses are not taken into account. So we proceed as though these responses didn't exist. And then we act really surprised when they come up. But instead of adjusting to the ideas of what it means to be human, because these are just basic human responses that I imagine that I recognize them in myself, and I imagine that you are not so different. And instead of concluding that we may not be programmable machines that can just be told how to behave, we kind of act as though the lack of acknowledgement of the human psyche kind of means that we stay in control. And I would argue that this makes us blind to something that is actually not so hidden. And those of you who have been with small children will know that toddlers, when you hide something under a table, believe that it's not there. And so it feels a bit like that we kind of assume that humans just respond in a rational way, and the stuff that is barely hidden under the table seems to kind of not be acknowledged. So the psyche's capacity for denial and willful destruction and violence is as surprising very often as trauma responses. But what we also don't acknowledge is the enormous beauty of the human psyche. The fact that as human beings, we're capable to transcend the impossible. So I'm talking about our capacity for fierce love. And that certain kinds of attachments and relationships make the impossible possible at times. And transcend adversity against all odds. I'm talking about the healing power of compassion, the beauty of connection, the deep insights that our intuition and also our dreams, waking dreams, but nighttime dreams as well, can reveal to ourselves. I'm talking about our capacity for sensuous knowledge that can't be translated into language and words, but that nevertheless we have the capacity to sense know, if that makes sense. and shifts of consciousness that can happen in a flash of a moment. Art and music have a way of transcending something that words can't. And all of these things are not news, but that's what settles on the margins. So again, we are blind to some of the horrendous stuff we are capable for or at. So my accent is German, so sometimes I kind of don't master the language. But it's also the beauty that we are capable of. And so the engineering approach to life, in that approach, the illogical, the emotional, and the irrational responses are often seen as a malfunction, like the slide before showed. And so the attitude is very quickly, how can we fix this? And how can this be eradicated? And the intention is to very quickly get back to a place of control and to disperse any sense of discomfort. And usually that is done with more rational responses, more logic, and clearer and louder marching orders. But by now it is probably clear that my point is that the human psyche is not a machine. Could you put the next slide up, please? So this also puts people like me, but maybe you are in the Faculty of Education, people like you as well, into a double bind. So a double bind is a situation that wherever I turn, the kind of consequences are negative. It's a catch-22 from which there is no good way out. Because in order to be heard and in order to be listened to, the focus needs to be on measurable, efficient, cost-effective, and replicable outcomes, and also quick fix solutions. And this demand has infected and affected all walks of life. It is part of the fabric of our culture. So catering to this demand is often the only way to get a job and the only way to get funding for projects. And I can't tell you how many people I have talked to who don't believe that this is the answer, but the way they have to write their project proposals means this is the language we have to use. So that's the catch-22. If you want to do something, you need money. And to get money, you have to enter this paradigm. And so as a profession that tends to the actual vast ecology of the human psyche, we have suddenly had to adopt the engineering approach to life. These are two completely different paradigms. So some of the neoliberal, colonial, and anthropocentric ideas of the dominant culture can also be found in theories of psychotherapy and psychology, and in our practices and professions. So part of what this book is trying to do works on two levels. At one point, we have to start with saying, how are we actually contributing to a paradigm that is costing us the earth? And how are our theories and practices also deeply colonial, deeply patriarchal, and part of a neoliberal mindset. And I don't work in education, but I imagine that that is true for any profession that needs to survive in this time. So we have to ask, how are we part of the problem before we can start thinking about how can we also be part of the solution? But of course, that's not the whole story, because we also and I talk about the profession of psychotherapy, we also have knowledge that goes into depth, that has a long tradition and ancestry and lineage, and that acknowledges the fact that what we call our soul is deeply entangled with the soul of the world. And so the contributors to the book ask us to remember what it means to be human beyond the limited maps that have been applied to the fabric of life. And of course, what is striking is that we don't just treat the environment out there in this way, we also treat ourselves in a very similar way, and others, in this actually quite cruel and reductive attitude to life. And at times, and I don't know whether you would agree or not, but at times to me it feels like we have started to allow a system that nobody designed on purpose. Nobody sat down and created a mastermind of this. We are all co-creating this. But that there's something as though we're not just factory farming chickens, but we're factory farming ourselves. Whilst we have a narrative applied a bit like gaslighting that tells a different story of freedom, of choice, but somehow on a collective level we keep taking very similar choices. So are they really ours? And so, as the slide before said, in Western culture, we mostly view good mental health as the ability to function symptom-free within a neoliberal paradigm. And this is a culture that is death-bringing to an ecosystem of life and the ecosystem of the earth. So if the ability to adapt to an ailing culture is our measure of health, then surely there's something wrong. And this culture is not just out there, it has become part of our relationships, it has become part of our marriages, it's in how we parent, it's in the way we love, it's in the way we have nuclear families, it's in the way we bring up our children, and it's in the way that we relate to each other and to ourselves. So hence, in the way as well that at least one strand is written into the ideas about human development and who we think we are as human beings. And in this culture, horrendous things have become normalized and have become acceptable. So all too often, the capitalist machinery has forced us to give up on our primary human satisfactions for the sake of meaningless work that turns us into producers and consumers of replaceable goods and services. And our self-worth and identity is intricately linked to our career path. So often we introduce ourselves as like, who are you? I am, and then it's a job description. And many people have a narrative that tells us how special and exceptional we are, and at the same time, many people feel unnecessary and have become used to this level of insult to their soul and what their soul is longing for. So surely as human beings, we're not made to hate Mondays and live for happy hour and holidays. I don't think that we're here in a way that we feel happy to have to, for children to have to raise their hand in order to be given permission to speak, to be told when they're allowed to drink and eat. I don't think that we're meant to be indoors on a beautiful day and light the magnificence of the night sky with neon lights. So there's something where we've become habituated to assault the integrity of our human nature on a systematic basis, neglecting almost everything that gives us deep satisfactions, such as participating with the rhythms of nature, or being woven into community, or expressing our aliveness through touch, through song, through untamed and undomesticated joy and creativity. And the gestures that have made us human for millennia have given way to sitting in front of a computer screen day after day. We then go home and watch television, shop online, maybe get drunk or high at weekends, and plan the occasional trip into nature as a form of recreation ground. And so my question is this really what we're meant to be at the so-called height of civilization? And many people can't tolerate this level of insult and experience this as a moral injury that we often don't actually name. So as a psychotherapist, I see so many people that actually suffer from the same, I would call, trauma. But the only map they have is to say there's something wrong with me. I am not functioning. So back to, I'm supposed to be symptom-free. What's wrong with me that I can't? And so let me just jump ahead a little. So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of traumatic growth. So for me and some other authors, co-conspirators in the book, we talk about this is actually an unacknowledged trauma that has become normalized. But what we know from psychotherapy is there's also something that we call traumatic growth. So this is also an opportunity. Because we know that deep and meaningful shifts can occur as a result of experiencing adversity. So very much like the call from Mary Oliver, who calls us into heartbreak. These shifts can occur not despite the heartbreak, but because of it. So in that light, climate despair can invite us back to a fuller life, in which we can gain a greater presence, more depth, and actually maybe what developmentally we might call more maturity. And that is because of our willingness to enter into this suffering, to see it, to name it, and to stay with it, and not to immediately fix it. So when we develop the capacity to face into this trouble without numbing on one side or without collapsing on the other, something has the potential to emerge. And often that something is utterly beautiful. So those of you who have experienced opening up when you felt utterly heartbroken will know that sometimes when we feel like we're at the point of breaking down, suddenly some people may come in that we did not expect. And even if we're alone, that certain thoughts or certain kinds of beauty can touch us that otherwise we wouldn't have been open to. Many people talk about a huge shift and transition in times of big breakages and losses. And so this is what some of the contributors to the book also talk about, that we may be at a threshold moment. or an evolutionary step that has the potential to touch everything, every decision. And it is really important to look at how are we actually really invested in holding everything together. Which parts of us are terrified about any change? And often there's not just one part. We have one part that is terrified and wants to hold it together, and another part that just really wants to let go. And here we're in the territory of psychotherapy. I think that that profession that I have been socialized into actually has something to offer, as well as our responsibility to also look at how we're part of the problem. So what if our symptoms are not weeds that need to be eradicated with psychological roundup? And what if our symptoms are actually the last frayed connection to a more soulful way of being? Something that calls to us from a depth that we may have forgotten even exists. So in that case, we wouldn't ask, what is it I can do to not feel this? What can I do to get rid of my depression or anxiety? In that case, we would have to actually turn towards the symptom and ask, what is it asking of me? How can I be in service of it? And that's quite a big turn. And what is needed for me to hear what the symptom has got to say to me? Because it may not speak in English. So these are the capacities that I invited in at the start. What is it that is part of my nervous system and my human capacity to sense and feel and dream and here I'm meeting the boundary of words. But what are the places I can go to? So what if the current moment asks us to develop the capacity to be in service to something that is far greater than our self-interest? And that's also true on a collective level. So on a collective level, I may ask what the meta-crisis may ask of the dominant culture. How do we need to stretch to be of service to its needs? And what fundamental change is called for that we are currently not willing to give or to listen to? And so instead of finding the answer to these questions, I think these are really big questions. We can take these questions for a walk in a forest. We can sit with these questions by the sea, which is for you not very far. We can write about them. We can engage in imaginal practices. But right now, I would invite you just very briefly, and including people at home, to just find a partner and to share what comes to mind in relation to these two questions. So just to repeat, the questions are, on a personal level, how do I need to stretch to be of service to something that is troubling me in relation to the state of the world? What might the trouble that I feel, or the anxiety or this quiet that I feel, maybe it's numbness, the absence of feeling. What might that be asking of you? And then also on a collective level, What do you think is asked of the dominant culture? And of course, in this exercise, we will just touch the absolute surface of the onion. And the question circles back and back. And we will, each time we go around, we will find a different answer. But there's something about this exercise that is just really like, if you just really quickly kind of find your answer. I don't want to stay on this too long. So the invitation is just a couple of minutes. See what comes up for you. Steve, are people in? Thank you. I think we can bring people back. Yeah. Okay. Could I bring you? Yeah. Okay. So you've got another minute. Okay. Okay. Can I bring your attention back? So I'm not going to ask you to share what you've just discussed with your partner, but whatever you've found, and as I said, it's very likely to just be, the very first layer of an onion. But here, whatever you may have said, we are at a crossroad already. Because once you named something, we can move into the engineering paradigm and go, okay, I have now named X, Y, and Z. So how do I fix that? How do I move from A to B? And what are my 5-point plans? And we've got a marketing machinery of self-help books that maybe you will write a bestseller. You can make a lot of money with how do I get from A to B? And I think what the more marginal parts of psychotherapy and psychology, and maybe education as well, know about is that actually we need to ask a completely different question. So we need to be interested in what is the context that is needed? Where is what I've just named, how is that situated? And how does that make sense within a system? So these parts in us are not something that are there for no reason. They have evolved in relationship to other parts. And so if I just have this targeted attention, then it is a little bit like me when I started to move to the country and I decided that now I would be a gardener. I went to the garden center and I picked a plant that I really liked. And I didn't really have the time to read the label. I just found it pretty. And then I went home and I planted it where I thought it needed to go because it fitted really well, or I wanted to see it from the window. And then the plant didn't do so well. And then I blamed myself and I said, I'm not made for gardening. It's not my thing. And I think we deal with the emotional landscape in a very similar way. We decide that, and this is a really big discussion at the moment in relation to climate change, hope is the thing that we need to feel. So this is like from an ecology of the human psyche, we name the thing that is rationally logical, that we can measure, has a positive impact. At least certain studies seem to prove that. But it's what is the question they're asking? And so with the gardening example is, I took no interest in the context, the conditions that the plant needed in order to grow. So if we want to talk about change, then a depth psychological question is, what conditions do we need to create in order for something else to want to grow? And then the change happens of its own accord. We don't actually have to do anything because in a living system, things cross-fertilize and they grow if the nourishment is right. But that's often seen as the boring thing. And how do I put that in a funding application? I'm going to attend to the ground. It's like, yeah, but what's the outcome? And the irony is that even projects that label themselves as systemic or even ecological are structured in a way when you want to get funding for them where you already need to say what the outcome is likely to be. But if you work in a systemic way, it needs to be emergent. You tend to the ground. And that's really important. So there's a shift in actually asking the question that is necessary to get to have a chance of a different outcome. And the different outcome is not guaranteed because I may live in an area where the soil is such and such. And that means, you know, psychologically as well, we have grown up in a certain context. And maybe this idea of eternal ascension and eternal growth is as flawed when we apply to our psyche, constant human development, as it is in terms of unregulated capitalism. maybe there's something where I actually need to stretch and learn to be happy with the way I've grown. And that actually maybe I can be loved and find meaning in the way that I have grown. And maybe there are people that can accept us and not turn us into a project. So I think we have, and when I say we here, I think the psychological professions, we've brought into this idea of turning ourselves into projects. And that's often how people come and ask for help. I don't like the way I am. Can you help to change me? And that's a similar catch-22. Because if I say, yes, I can help you, I'm already part of a paradigm that is at war. I'm at war with the system that has created certain aspects of me. And we tend not to learn so well in situations of war and conflict. So it's like, what's the stretch that I can turn towards these parts with compassion and interest and relationship? So if climate change changes everything, as Naomi Klein says, then that also means that everything must change. And this includes much of what we have come to experience as familiar, our outlooks and our beliefs. And I think that is true for every profession. And the well-known systems thinker Friedrich Capra, who has also really nicely endorsed the book, points out that the dysfunction of complex systems on the world stage is primarily a crisis of perception. So he believes that our innocent-seeming everyday beliefs are actually the glue that molds things in their rigid place. And the systems thinker Donella Meadows concurs when she says that changing the way we see things is one of the most powerful leverage points for systems change. And so that includes education, not education from A to B. And I don't know about you, but I think there's something incredibly powerful in that. Because that means that all of us are part of this leverage point, because all of us are co-creating the culture that we live in. So each of us we can't be outside of that culture, we are in it. And that means that in every action, in every decision, we have a choice. And the choice is not from A to B, but the choice is disruption. Trying to do things differently and to see what happens. So how we see things determines every choice we make, every action we take or every action that we avoid. It determines how we relate to others, how we relate to ourselves, and what we agree with and don't agree with. And also, really importantly, how we relate to people that we don't agree with, that think differently from us. So we're in a time of extreme polarization. And again, the question is, how am I part of doing that rather than just pointing it out over there? What am I doing that maintains this? And how we see things also determines how we respond in the crisis. And so it is therefore important to think about business as unusual. And this means listening to the voices that have been pushed to the margins and seeing how we are part to what is it that we push to the margins in ourselves and others in the culture. And what's the move to turn towards it? And I just want to illustrate this with a little story that happened a couple of months ago, where I was invited to a friend's house, and she told me that a couple of people that work on climate change were also going to be there. And it was, it must have been a few months ago. It was during, so I live in England, the accent is German. It was during London Climate Week. So what the two people who are very much involved in climate change talked about is an excitement of who was there. My God, and so was there, and I talked to them. And I can understand the excitement, and I too have this part in me that has been socialized into who's who, and am I effective, and am I heard, and I've had a platform. And I guess we all have this part. But I asked them who was not there. And there was this pause of, huh? And I guess we can all recognize that in ourselves as well, this idea of, you are messing up this really beautiful conversation that makes me feel good. And so I think one of the skills that we need is to be a pain. And to be able to stand awkward conversations. And I find this very difficult. I have learned that it's easier to be a good girl. And I have learned how to read a room very quickly and to know what is expected of me. So to read the room and to know what's expected of me and to not do it is a big deal. And it's also a privilege. Not everybody is really able. It's not safe for everybody to do this. And it didn't feel safe for me to do it, but I did it anyway. And actually, in comparison to what other people kind of would have to put up with, it was totally safe. And so I stuck with it, and I think I was heard. There was something about, oh yes, Jeff Bezos may have been in the room, but who is not? Yes. And who is systematically not in the room? And actually, how can we use our privilege to get people in the room and to step out of our platform and to allow others to have a voice? And they may not be so used to using their voice, and so may be a little bit more clumsy. So as well, how can we use our power and our privilege to support people in this? So then the evening went on, and we went for a walk, and it was already getting a bit late, and we walked up a hill, and the sun went down, and it was stunningly beautiful. And as the sun had gone down, it started to get darker, and we got to the edge of a forest. And I walked ahead, and there was a stile to climb, and I turned around because I've been socialized to be the kind of nice girl. And I asked them, what should we do? Should we go back because it's going to get dark? And when you stand on these thresholds, the dark looks very dark. So looking into the forest, it looked pitch black. Whereas looking back over the field, there was still a little bit of light and it looked very pretty. So I asked, I gave my voice away as the facilitator. And somebody who is very used to using his voice with a lot of authority said very convincingly, well, it would be ridiculous to go into this forest. It is totally dark. It wouldn't be safe. So I don't think there's a question we should turn back. And all of us turned around and started walking. And I'm so grateful for my friend who suddenly stopped and said, do you know what? I think that's exactly what's wrong with the world. And so again, it was an awkward moment of, what do you mean? And she said, we want to stay in the light and we want to stay in control, and that we don't want to take any risk. And I think that's exactly how we respond to climate change. And so there was a stunned silence. And then there was, all right, let's go in the forest. So we climbed the stile. And so for me, this is actually something that is familiar. And I imagine that is true for you too. That sometimes when we actually face into the dark, it's not as dark as we thought. And so what looked like an absolute no-go area, why would we want to do that? It suddenly became quite magical. And it changed the entire mood. It changed the conversation, and everybody was a bit like, oh, this is actually quite interesting and quite exciting. And so it's the same question, like when I said, sometimes actually staying with the trouble or going into heartbreak, going into dark places, seems like, why would I want to do that? But when we're there, some amazing things can happen. And I think it was Thomas Barry who said, can't remember the whole poem off by heart, but we find out that the dark too is traveled by dark feet and dark wings. And Theodor Roethke said, in dark times, the eye begins to see. We start to see differently. And we start to think differently, relate differently. And so I guess this is an invitation to be more courageous and step into the unknown and into the dark together. And the other really nice thing that happened is it bound us together. We suddenly were a group of 4 rather than sort of dispersed conversations. So how are we doing for time? I probably should jump a few things, but so the other part is, how can we step out of the ordinary? So Vanessa really kindly, so what does it mean to step over that threshold? And Vanessa very kindly introduced me. And of course, as it's traditional, it was my job description, what my achievements in life. And well, it's no surprise I've written it myself, as you know, this is the other thing that we do. It's this kind of, we're looped in a sort of agreement of ways of behaving with each other where everybody kind of knows that, but we're not naming it. And in terms of what I've also learned, of course, is to not tell you about my failures. That's the stuff that is left out because my self-worth is rewarded for the successes and achievements. But the successes and achievements would not be there without the failures. And so that's the stuff that is pushed to the margins. It doesn't mean that it's not there, but we agree not to talk about it. And of course, who I am is so much more than my profession, and you are so much more than whatever I might assume. You being here at university, or you know, also people at home. I'm here as a mom that is very concerned for all of our children. I'm here as a partner. I'm here as a lover, a neighbor, a citizen, a carer for an elderly mother, And I'm here as the continuation of my ancestral lineage, which includes everything that my ancestors have suffered, but also what my ancestors have perpetrated. I can't step out of that. And that is here with me. And I am also here with the gifts that have come down the line. That may not be mine. They may have originated somewhere else. And so this individualistic lens makes everything mine. And I imagine, like you, that we've all learned to see ourselves as individuals that are separated from others, that have the capacity to be willful about who we are. And I think that this story leaves out so much too. So I was born in East Germany during the time of the Cold War. My mum was a political prisoner. And so the fear that I have experienced as a child in her eyes when doors were closed, or the kind of suspicion of pretty much everybody that you could be betrayed, was not a dysfunction of hers, it was a response to a dysfunctional culture. But that fear was part of my context, and so it has shaped me. And so like the way that I have shaped myself around that, is that mine? Is that hers? Or is that part of the culture? Where is it? Where do we situate it? And the decision we take of where we place that makes an enormous amount of difference in how we then, what our next action is. So I don't think it is mine. And I have made it my job to help people actually tell a different story. And I think that's what the 34 contributors have tried to do, to tell a different story, one that is a collective story. And it's not either or, it is both. There's something in the way that, of course, I have had my own adaptation to the circumstances. And yes, part of that is individual, my adaptation. I had to put creative effort into that. But it is also contextual, and it is also has a wider circle. And to finish, let me just see, because yes, there is. I just leave a couple of things out. But I definitely want to make sure that I can talk to you about anthropocentrism, that is part of culture of modernity. So the fact that I have learned as part of my education that we are, as humans, really special. And that being really special has to do with my capacity to think. But of course, like you, I'm also here as an animal, as a mammal. And as part of that, as I said in the previous bit, we wouldn't be here if we didn't have more non-human organisms living in us than human cells. So what is human? And this amazing nervous system has evolved over thousands of years. And our senses here have the capacity to pick up the smells in this room. And our breathing bodies, my breathing body feels your breathing body. And whilst you are listening to me, in the room or at home, whether we are conscious of it or not, our nervous systems are syncing. I can feel the atmosphere with which you are listening to me. And the way that you listen to me helps me to find my words and to feel more relaxed. And so, who's speaking? Where is the agency? Because if I was speaking to people who look incredibly critical, I would freeze up and different words come out. And when we're really synced, then sometimes ideas, it's like, where are they located? Is it my idea or is it your idea? We created something together. I'm the one expressing it, but where is this located? And so then I'd like to extend our attention to the room that we're in. This is a room in a university. It's a very rectangular room. And so how are we being choreographed by the space, the place where we're meeting? The way we dress, the way that I am given permission to talk. And in a few minutes, the tradition is that you are the question askers, when actually you are so much more. Maybe you have much more interesting things to say than I have, or much more knowledge about this than I have. So there's a choreography here. The way we move, the way you sit is not by choice. It's the design of the chair gives your body expression. The history of academia is part of our meeting today. And these are things that we often don't name in this individualistic culture where everything comes back down, it's me. And so it is really important, I think, to help, and that is true for COP meetings, of course, as well, climate meetings. I have been part of a really interesting climate meeting at Westminster in the Parliament. And whilst we were standing outside, people were talking about their families, people talking about their having to attend to relatives. They were talking about what they were doing last night. And then we came into the room, and even the intonation of our voices started to change. We sat around a round table, we had little microphones, the voice got very serious. And it was very clear that certain, like who I am at home no longer mattered. The fact that there were mums and dads and grandparents in there no longer mattered. And so there's a reduction. And in that reduction, certain thoughts can't be thought. And then, so we're continuously creating the same pattern. And I have been in a meeting where somebody stood up and started to sing, where there was so much conflict in the room. And the song was so, not sad, but it was moving. And it did something to the entire room. And suddenly there was movement. But who would dare in really official meetings? This is we have to have the capacity to disrupt, to say, I think we should start singing at the start of every meeting. Or maybe every 15 minutes to have a pause and breathe and actually notice each other. Where there's more capacity for our nervous systems to kind of be open, notice more, for more to be included. And the very last thing I want to say is, So with a systemic approach, and when we work with disruption, it also means when these patterns that constantly create each other start to recede or collapse. In the natural environment, we talk about composting. But sometimes the kind of product is so toxic that it's beyond the process of composting. And so Harriet Sams describes a method that invites us to sit with wounded places, to not flock into the beauty of nature, but to actually find the places that are 10, 15 minutes from our homes. And usually people have no problem finding a place that they would identify as wounded. And it's not about fixing it, but to sit with curiosity with that place and to start relating to it. And to see what happens. And when I invite people to do that, very often what happens is actually that they realize that their wounds and the wounds of the land are not different. And that there's also beauty in broken places. And that sometimes we may also project onto places, a bit like projecting onto the forest, the darkness of the forest. It's like so easy to just go to nature as a place of beauty, and it's this turning around. What actually happens? And a friend of mine who is an artist called Wallace Heim has done so at a nuclear processing site where nuclear waste was buried in the sea. So it's in England, in Sellafield. And also where nuclear waste is reprocessed for warfare. And what she proposes is, how can we extend care to places that are so toxic that it is dangerous to be in relationship with them? And that takes more than a human lifetime to be in relationship with. And we actually need to take care of these places. So this is a site that for the next thousands of years, we're in, like, the next several generations will inherit this toxicity. But that doesn't let me off the hook, because I need to take care of that place now. And I think something similar also happens with traumatic events. Some events are so deep and have scarred the emotional landscape or the fabric and texture of the collective so deeply that we do need to take care of it, but we can't fix it. But we know that several generations need to actually learn how to take care of this. And so I just want, I won't read this piece from Wallace, but I can send you a link. What she found is when she started, so she's an artist, and she used materials from this site symbolically for this nuclear waste. And when she started to work with the materials, she found out something that really surprised her, because as she started to engage with it, she had the feeling that she was taking care in a way that reminded her of both how you might take care of a baby or a dead body. And that suddenly something reciprocal started, where she felt or projected that the material was also taking care of her. So through the engagement, there was the process of reciprocity. And so lastly, I want to suggest that maybe we don't need more commentary about the earth. Maybe what we need is to listen to disclosures from the earth. And this would entail a reciprocity in the meeting, which means that we need to start speaking a different language, one which is not a progress-fixated rant of overconfident hubris, but maybe a softly spoken language, one with less words and longer silences. And with that, I want to finish with a poem by the German poet Rilke. And he wrote this in a letter. And what he said is, have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live into them. The point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, sometime in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. So thank you very much for listening.